I just had so much fun interviewing Laurie, Moret, and Carol Greene about their book on national security and found out some really interesting tidbits, both about the industry and how it was to collaborate and co-author, but also how relevant their book is to the wider audience of consulting psychology. And I own the copy of the book, even though I don't work in that area. And I think that you'll find some really interesting reasons why you might want to consider reading it too. I'm very excited today to be able to interview you two because you're going to be our first co-authors on this book podcast series. And so this is really exciting to hear from two people who have actually collaborated together. And today we've got Laurie Moret and Carol Greene, who are authors of Consulting Psychology and National Security Organizations, which is also a really fun topic. So thank you both for being here.
Thank you. We're glad to be here.
Thanks for the invitation.
Oh, good. Well, let's just dive right in because everybody wants to hear more from you than from me. So let's hear about you. What do you do? How are you employed normally? And, perhaps are you doing similar work or different work? Tell us about yourselves.
Well, at the time we were writing the book, I was the head psychologist at the Marine Raider Training Center in North Carolina. But I have since retired and doing primarily consulting work for the military at this point.
And I'm working as an organizational psychologist in my own little practice. I've had my own practice for about 15 years, and I work in four main areas. I do leadership consulting, so things like coaching and assessment, talent management, so things like mentoring programs, leadership programs, engagement surveys. Organizational performance might be things like succession planning or strategic planning. And then I work with some small businesses doing partner mediation with another firm.
So how did you two come together to write this book? I mean, did you know each other ahead of time, or how did this partnership start?
Well, Carol and I didn't know each other very well at all. Rodney Lohman, who's the editor for the series, reached out to me and asked if I'd consider writing it. And I went back and forth about it for a little while. And ultimately, the thing that led me feeling cautious was taking on a book by myself while managing my practice. So I asked Rodney if I could have a co-author. And then I started doing a little networking. And through the grapevine, I heard more about Carroll and what an amazing, talented consultant he is and some of the work he was doing. And so I called and pleaded if he would consider co-writing the book with me. And he answered in the affirmative.
You didn't have to plead very much.
Well, so how did you squeeze it in then? You're both working full time, right? While you're writing this.
Yeah, I think, well, I know for me, I'd say we have to have good project management skills anyway in our work. So I think we're both pretty organized. And then once we started working on it, there was a lot of back and forth, piecing it together and figuring out what we could each take on at a given time, but extra hours usually.
Yeah, a lot of extra hours. As a military active duty psychologist, you're essentially on duty 24 hours a day anyway. And whenever the organization needs you, they call you. But in my particular job, they didn't call very often. So I was accustomed to working, morning hours. My wife and I both tend to rise pretty early, around 4 o'clock. And so I had plenty of off-duty hours to do the primary amount of the work in.
Hopefully the sleeping was on those off-duty hours too. I was thinking 4 o'clock in the morning, you must go to bed a little early. Yikes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, let's talk about what the book is about. I mean, national security, and I'd love to hear in that also how you two approach it perhaps a little bit differently or similarly.
Yeah, so I mean, originally the vision for the book was kind of imagining what it was like to work in either national security or initially even public safety settings. And I think the more we talked about it, we started seeing lots of ways that they're similar too. So part of the book encompasses areas of difference and similarity. We talk about roles and responsibility, culture, some key competencies, and then some things that are really different, like the clearance process. At the time we wrote the book, there was a lot going on with Guantanamo Bay, and that was timely because we do have a chapter in there around ethical considerations. And there's some things there that are, of course, very similar. We're all psychologists and follow the APA standards, but there's some things that are a little bit different in terms of how it operates in the environment. I don't know, Carol, what you'd want to add to that.
Yeah, I think as an operational psychologist, I was trained initially clinically, but as an operational psychologist, I found that ethics, the ethics application for clients is a little different when you're working for what I call a third party. If you're working for the government and you're doing assessment selection, just as an example, the people that come in as candidates to be selected may or may not be happy with the result in terms of how they were assessed, who was selected. But the government is generally always happy with the product. So that's very different than when you think about the ethics of a clinical setting where the person that you are affecting their life is your client. So there's a lot of similarity to consulting psychology for a military psychologist doing operational work, because you're working for a client and yet your work impacts potentially the career opportunities or the function, the performance of other people in the organization that are not your primary client, possibly. So there's a lot of ethical concerns about contracting and who gets information. And I've always found Division 13 to be very, very useful in terms of understanding all the ethical parameters involved in that.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me, in addition to the ethics in your book, was how careful you have to be about the whole process and how it impacts such greater organizations. I mean, the whole country, right? If you have a security breach or something, and all the different things you have to consider, even just in engaging at the beginning.
Yeah, I think we started a lot of our early conversations feeling the same way. Like, the impact could be so large. But then when I started comparing us to other industries, in financial services or in marketing or professional services, we could easily come up with examples where the impact is equally significant or the financial implications are perhaps more significant. And so we started pulling back a little bit and focusing more on similarities than I think we ever anticipated. And you might even notice from hearing how we talk, I work across industries and do the kind of work that's probably more typical across organizational psychologists or consulting psychologists. And Carroll has spent his career doing more government, national security work primarily. And so I think it helped us to think about kind of what is really unique to this kind of work and where we might see that look similar or different in other industries.
I love the humility there too, that, yeah, there are big implications, but there are other big implications in other work too. Thank you.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm curious, because this is really exciting for me to hear from co-authors, and like you didn't even know each other that well. Tell us a little bit about what it was like to collaborate on a book.
Well, it was a lot of fun for me, and a lot of Laurie provided so much help. I have had some opportunities to write articles before that had to go through the editing process, and I can have a short fuse when it comes to too much editing and too many ideas about how I should be expressing my concepts, and so I found that having a co-author is really nice, because when I get frustrated with a particular point, or even with my own trying to express in my words some kind of complicated concept, having somebody else to bounce the thoughts off of was extremely helpful. But in addition, sometimes just doing a handoff of the topic itself or of that particular piece of writing. It was really good to be able to lean on Laurie's expertise and her ability to deal with things that I found more frustrating.
I'd say that was completely mutual. I think, fortunately, the things that frustrate each of us were usually different. And so when I was feeling really bothered about something, Carroll was like, that's no big deal. And he would take it on. So I think I felt very lucky in that regard. And, early on, we had a lot of conversations around how we would manage things. And then when they worked, we kept using them. And when it didn't, we tried again. I know one of those things was version control. Having two people work on a book at the same time can mean that we're both making changes in a copy and then forget or not be able to realize which is the most recent. So I think we spent a lot of time early on figuring that out. And ultimately what we decided is we would each take lead on a chapter, and the other person was not allowed to touch it, no matter how much they wanted to tinker with it, no matter how hard it was to resist, make your notes somewhere else, until it was their turn to edit a review. And that just meant spending a little bit more time making sure it looked like it was written in one voice, which ultimately was, we spent time going back through to make sure that happened. But we worked back and forth on chapters to manage that version.
That did work really, really well. And it's pretty easy for me to slip into a version control problem. So Laurie was very helpful. I think her organizational skills were instrumental in helping us avoid some of those problems. The other thing that was really helpful, I thought, was being able to collaborate on case study write-ups. Because I enjoy reading a book where there are actual case studies and sometimes actually dialogue exchanges between coaches and clients or consultants and customers. So the ability to include those, I think, adds a lot of meat and a lot of enjoyable reading for some people. So we wanted to make them completely anonymous. So we did, I think, a pretty good job of exchanging ideas and concepts and rewriting them, sometimes out of a military context into a civilian context or vice versa, changing the nature of the client in order just to make them not identifiable and protect people's confidentiality. And
I think we were both really cognizant that we're just two people working in this space out of many, many people who work in a variety of settings. And it's such a wide ocean of kinds of roles people play. And so another thing that we wanted to do to bring in other voices was we interviewed lots of people in the field. We tried to get people that were representative of every agency and all the different kinds of roles we could imagine. And so Carol and I collaborated kind of on our Rolodexes of who we thought could fill all those spaces. Carol has such a strong network. He was able to help introduce all kinds of people to the project that I might not have ever known or thought of. And then because I had more flexibility, not working in a SCIF, I don't work day to day in a classified setting, I was able to do the interviews, and then we collaborated on kind of reviewing the feedback and interpreting it. But that was another great part of the process, and collaborating not just amongst the two of us, but other professionals in the field.
Yeah, Laurie's interviews of, I think it was upwards of 20 different, very experienced security world and military world professionals, and gave me a lot more confidence that things that I was speaking out of my experience actually fit with the observations being made by those people in the interviews. So that really helped me just in terms of my personal confidence in writing.
Yeah, that makes so much more authority for the book too. I mean, like you said, you're two people who do this work, but having a large understanding of the landscape from talking to others and your breadth of experience between the two of you, you really can speak to how it's done and help people understand that. Yeah, I was really impressed with the examples in the book. So it's one that I've turned to a lot, even though I don't actually work in that space, but just as an example of the kind of care. And sometimes working with technical leaders, I reach into that area a little bit, but haven't had to go through the whole security. I'm wondering, in terms of the book, I mean, it was published in 2019. It's been a few years, not too many. What has changed, or what would you add, or if you could, I mean, since then?
Carol, anything come to mind right away?
Yeah, well, the first thing that comes to mind is more just a comment on that. If I could not necessarily go back, but if I could add in things today, they would probably be addressing the more controversial topics that we would have loved to dig a little deeper into, and didn't, just for the purpose of, one, trying to stay purely objective, although we were certainly affected by all the all the controversy and around, anywhere from 2012 on all the way up to probably 2020 or 23, and it's still going on in some settings. But that would be the only thing I would think. If I were going to say more, I think I would dig deeper into all of the sides of the controversy. I don't think there's any controversy or in any point of view on national security consultation by psychologists that I don't see the reason in. I can see the reasoning behind everybody's, and I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful that there are people who will take up different parts of this challenge and hit the different windmills from their own point of view. So that's the only thing I would do. I think I would dig deeper into the controversies.
I think that's a great point. When we started the book, our audience is really early career or transitioning psychologists. So it was intended to be not superficial, but to provide a broad overview of what you can expect if you work in this space or if you're wanting to get into this space. And so when things that might feel more controversial or areas where we would want to go into more depth came up, we had to balance how many pages do we have. And that was a tight limit. And we also had to manage what would be most appealing to people entering the field versus maybe a really senior audience who would have loved, I think, to have gotten into the depth and the nitty gritty of some of those controversies. But it's also an interesting field to get into controversial topics on, because most of the professionals that I work in this space really value data, and they value moderating emotion. And so even in a highly political environment, if you walk into most national security settings, you're not going to have any idea whose party, who follows. And so it was an interesting time when we wrote the book, when there actually was, something going on that was a little bit more emotional and political that people were willing and wanted to talk about. So we had to struggle and think about that. I'm still not sure, Carol, if I would go back and add it, but I probably would want to dip my toe in it a little bit.
Yeah.
Sounds like that could be a whole book in itself. I mean, have you written anything about those kind of controversies in other books or articles, or do you have any plans to?
I don't, but I bet there is a book out there somewhere, right?
Yeah. I have a number of peer-reviewed articles in journals where myself and some of my colleagues, particularly Morgan Banks, and then several other people have addressed the controversy from the operational psychology or the consulting psychology standpoint, looking at it primarily from a standpoint of, like I said before, what I call third-party client, where the individual who may be impacted by the decisions made by the government or by the business that you're consulting for, they're going to be affected in some kind of way, and they're going to be happy or not happy with the way that impact comes out. But the ethics of that are very different, and I think it's very different than what many psychologists in the big world of psychology, who are clinical psychologists. Not that they're totally divorced from that kind of third-party ethical consideration, because when they do consultation, even if it's on clinical issues, they ultimately come in contact with that same kind of thing. So if they're consulting in a forensic setting or in a law enforcement setting, trying to provide clinical expertise, then they're stuck in that same dilemma that we always are, where you have a third party as a client. So I think it's a very interesting area, and I've always loved the challenge of trying to keep an ethical middle ground with consideration for everybody's confidentiality and welfare. But it is ripe for controversy, and Joanie, you're absolutely right. It would cover many books all by itself.
And just to come back to something that you said, Carol, about when there's a third party client, I think that's an issue in all applied settings. So, whether or not you're doing operations in national security, or whether you're, working in a professional service firm, being clear up front about whether you're supporting the individual or the team or the company or the system or what have you is important to parse out up front. And so I think that there's probably is quite a bit of common understanding among psychologists around the importance of understanding who the client is up front.
That
Yeah,
raises a really interesting point because, I mean, people who are reading this series of books, even if they don't imagine themselves getting into national security, just having this example is really important because it does come up other places too. And seeing that and the sticky situations that can arise, or who is your client, who are you talking to, reading your book. That's why I said I've referred to it many times just to learn about it, even though I don't consult in that area. I think it's really important. So I would hope that our viewers and listeners are paying attention here for ripe examples of these kind of issues that come up in just general consulting psychology. I'm wondering if any unexpected opportunities came up from writing the book. I mean, either in consulting or authoring or anything.
Well, I mean,
Lori,
for me,
you got
the
thoughts on that?
opportunity I got the opportunity to work with Carroll.
Yeah.
I got the opportunity to work with APA and go through their editing process and be exposed to that. And I think both of those were very worthwhile for me. And so I appreciate that. It was supportive of when I went forward to apply for fellow status with Division 13. And so that was also helpful. But in terms of actual work, my practice is all referral based, and I don't know that I would have seen any different work come through as a result of the book, but it's certainly supportive and feels good to clients to see that there's some thinking and expertise behind what we're doing.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't think there have been any different business opportunities or consulting opportunities, but I do think having the book out there allows one. I have younger psychologists or even psychologists who have been around for a while comment on the book or comment of having referred to something in the book in their writing. That's very gratifying. I think one of the things at my age that I look for reassurance about is that I've done something with my time on this earth that is worthwhile and that has helped somebody else solve a problem of some kind. So just hearing that is very, very rewarding for me.
Yeah, I can agree. How about in terms of the process of writing and the series? And you said a little bit about the editing there, but was there anything unexpected in working with the APA on a book, or how did that come out?
I'd say there were two things that were a little bit unexpected to me. I think one was learning when they would want to have input and when they wouldn't. So getting a sense of the back and forth around the topic or the kinds of things we wanted to include, just learning when we needed to check in and get guidance. The other was that there are great resources available to help with things like references and editing. And so when both Carol and I decided that we didn't want to spend as much time as would be taken to go back through the whole document and look at certain minutia in the editing process, we were able to find support to do that, which we felt very grateful about.
Yeah, very grateful.
Yeah. So what else do you think people should hear about from you two before I wrap things up? What have I missed?
As I was looking, I went back and looked through the book today, and I thought about, well, what audiences might I? Because now, as I look back at it, I think, and I hadn't read anything in it in well over a year, I guess, and as I look back through it, I thought, well, there's a lot of good detail in here. I didn't remember that might be very interesting for anybody who's just thinking, well, do I want to go to work for the government? If you're getting out of graduate school in a variety of different areas and thinking about doing consulting or training or any kind of assessment work or going to work for the government at some executive level, I just got the feel that it might be very useful because it's a very short read, but it might be very useful for a lot of people who are just thinking about, do I want to go to work for the government? Because I think there's there's so few people that work, particularly in the military. But for the government in general, in terms of our population today, I think there are a lot of assumptions out there about what the military is, who works in national security, who works for the FBI, the CIA, that kind of thing. And a lot of the assumptions are purely erroneous. So I think just reading through this book would give somebody who is interested in working for the government a much clearer idea of who will you work with, what is the quality of people you will work with, and how passionately can you enjoy the work that you do in that setting.
I would just add, I try to do something on a fairly regular basis where I'm continuing to learn and keep my skills up. And I would say participating either as a learner or as an author is totally worth it. So if anybody is watching this and thinking about getting involved in the process as an author or learning more in an area or trying another field, I think it is so rewarding to put the effort in and to have the experience and to continue to grow. And I'm really glad that I was able to participate with Carol.
Yeah, well, we're glad too that you wrote this. I'm going to pop this up here. I have a Kindle copy. So yes, excellent book. And I would recommend it to anyone who's watching or listening to this episode. I want to thank you both for being willing to be interviewed about your book. Thank you, Carol and Laurie.
Thank you, Joanie.
You're welcome. Thanks for having us.